Welcome, everyone, to this year's mental well-being series called Finding the Words. And I think just from the amount of participants, the first session on perfectionism is a hot topic and something that we want to help our students with. So with no further delay, I want to introduce Dr. Hayley Watson. We are so glad to have you back this year and doing our mental well-being series. So I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Welcome back for those of you that were with us last year, and welcome to those of you who are new to this. So I'm going to jump in. I will share my screen. There we go. So this series across the year is called Finding the Words because it's based actually around a book that I've just finished writing that's going to be out in March. And the whole focus of the book is it was designed because of the amount of questions I get asked from educators, from teachers, which is that concern about saying the wrong thing. I don't know how to have these conversations, or I'm nervous about having these conversations with students around mental health or around their well-being because I'm not a trained therapist. I'm not a psychologist, and I don't want to harm them. And I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't want to trigger a reaction in them, which is a really, really common thing to feel. And so the reason I wrote this book is to give educators specifically the language and the tools and mostly the confidence so that you know that the things that you're saying are the things that are going to help. Because the biggest risk to students with any well-being challenge is that we're not talking about it. That's the worst thing we can do, really, because if they're struggling with something, it's there. And if nobody's talking to them about it, then they're never going to feel like it's okay to talk about, and they're never going to have the tools that they need in order to move through it. So these conversations, sometimes we feel like we're bumbling, sometimes we feel like they're awkward. And the whole idea and the whole goal of these sessions and also my book is to really help you to understand and know how to have that confidence to know that you're saying things that are really helpful to your students. So each of these sessions, we're going to review the thing that I'm going to start with first, which is the overall conversation model. And this model applies to any situation. And then I'm going to specifically boil it down into the topic for that session. And today is all about perfectionism. And that is something that is so prevalent in students. Especially, not only, but especially in independent school settings, a lot of the time there is more of that in the sense of parents having maybe potentially higher expectations, pressure, things like that, really common and normal. It's also such a common trait, I think, in us as adults. I definitely struggle with perfectionism a lot. It's definitely something that I have done across my life to cope with challenges. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and then dive into how to use language and conversations to really support your students with that. So in terms of perfectionism, the thing that we want to start with is the understanding that it's all about control. It's all about feeling out of control, feeling things that we don't want to feel, feeling emotions, thinking thoughts that seem unacceptable to us, and trying to control them through our actions. And usually perfectionism is masking the exact opposite. So usually when we're trying to show a perfect image on the outside, it's because deep down we actually think the opposite of ourselves. We think quite low of ourselves, which can be a little bit confusing because sometimes it's obvious with a student that there is some low self-esteem happening, and other times it's not obvious at all. And it seems like, hey, here's this straight A student, here's this, they're an athlete, they're doing all the things, they seem happy, they seem content. But deep down, if they're always focused on being the best or being perfect, we always have to understand that underneath all of that is a fear of failure, because it's a fear of affirming what they secretly think about themselves. And what's really important to recognize, this, like every other behavior in students that's not that helpful for their well-being, it's a trauma response. Sometimes it means they've gone through something really big, and it always comes back to control. So, like for me, for example, things in my early life were very chaotic and out of control. So that's my trauma response to that, was if I can just be perfect, then I can feel a little bit more in control. Sometimes it's relational. So if there's a parent that's really erratic, or relationships that are erratic, we try to be perfect to control the other person and their moods. That can be really, really common. And sometimes it's just that feeling of loss, abandonment, even going through COVID and things happening that are very out of control. Basically, anything that has been a challenge for that student, big or small, one of their responses could be to try to change themselves in order to make the situation better. And it always comes down to a feeling we're trying to avoid. We're trying to control our feelings. We don't want to feel that out of control, worthlessness, whatever it is that we're trying to get away from. So that's where perfectionism comes from. So our goals in having conversations and supporting students are to help students feel safe. That's the thing to always remember. If a student's being perfectionistic, that's a form of anxiety. So they don't feel safe in themselves to feel what they're feeling, to be who they are. So we're trying to help them feel safe in themselves. And the reason why we want to do that is so that they don't feel like they have to hold on so tightly. They don't have to be in so much control. They can let go of that control a little bit. And that means that they can become more spontaneous in their life. So they don't have to be so constricted, so focused on the outcome, so intense in their interactions or their schoolwork or their activities. They can be more fluid. They can enjoy themselves more. So that's our goal. So this is the model that I wanted to take you through at first. And again, this applies to every well-being situation. So I'm going to repeat this model at the beginning of each of these sessions, just as a little bit of a review. And the reason for that is that what we're trying to understand and really embed and take away is that even though it's new, or it could be new, some of this language could be a framework that you're not used to yet, the more you are familiar with it, the more you realize that these are probably things you do already with students. And so what I want you to walk away from this series with is a confidence of, oh, I get it. I know the things that I can say or do, no matter what my students are facing. So that's why I really want to reinforce this model each time. But let's just go through it briefly, and then we can jump into how it applies specifically to perfectionism. So when you think of your role as an educator, you're not a therapist. You don't have to be diving into their past or even that much of their experience necessarily. So the pressure's off in that sense. And what you don't need to do either is fix it for them. And that's a really important thing for all of us to remember, because most of us in the helping professions, we want to make things better. We want to fix things for students. And so just starting with that goal and that reminder that it's not about making it better for them, it's only about creating space for them to do the reflection that they need to do to learn how to help themselves. That's the goal. So always starting from that place. So we're trying to create space. And in that space, there's two main things that we can do that are really, really helpful. The first is that we're opening the door to their own self-reflection. And there's three things that I'll go through that really help students do that. And the reason that part is so important is because if we don't self-reflect, this is true for any of us, we don't self-reflect, if we don't know what's happening in us, and if we don't feel safe to really consider what's happening in us, if we go straight to the other really important piece, which is the taking action, which is where we often want to go first. We want to just suggest something. And we are good at that now a little bit more in our culture. We have lots of skills. We know about deep breathing. We know about things that can help students. And if we go straight to that taking action, students will never really understand why they're taking that action or why they did the thing that was unhelpful in the first place, which means they're never going to actually build the resilience to do that in a helpful way for themselves. And when it comes to perfectionistic students, they might be really good at doing all the right things for their well-being. So they might actually be quite regimented with that. You might tell them, to take deep breaths before they do an exam, and they might do that every single time. But if they don't have the reflection to understand, what am I feeling? What's happening in me? Why am I doing this? How can I understand myself better? They're never going to make a significant change. They're just going to be, doing something over and over again that helps in the moment, but never helps in the long term. So that's why opening the door is really important. And then it's equally important to help students do things to help themselves, so that, again, they learn that they can help themselves, that they don't need someone else to come and fix it for them. So these are the two big things that we're trying to help students with in this space that we're creating. So in opening the door, the three things we can do, the first is validation. So making sure that students feel seen and heard and know that we care and know that we care about them and what they're going through, even if we think what they're doing is really unhelpful or even harmful to someone else or themselves, we can still validate them as a person. So this is probably the most important. That's why it's number one here. And these steps don't always go in order, but that validation piece, if we don't start there, and you probably know that already as an educator, if you don't validate a student, if you don't make them feel like you care about them, it's pretty hard for them to be able to communicate about anything with you. The second piece is helping them recognize their patterns. So helping them notice what they're doing that's not so helpful. And the more you validate, the more you can point out patterns in a way that doesn't feel super confronting for them. And the third thing is talking about and helping them explore their feelings. So as you know, if you've been into any of my other sessions, I talk about feelings a lot, because there's always a feeling underneath every single challenge. And we don't talk about feelings that much in our culture in a real way. And so giving students the opportunity to really explore what is the feeling that's underneath this challenge, that is such a helpful way for them to soften and open and be able to be a little bit more connected to themselves in that moment. So that's the goal in terms of opening the door. And then on the other side, with action, there's three things that we can help students with here, and we want to focus on in our conversations. The first is paradigms. And what that means is changing perspectives. So one element that usually comes up in a student's pattern is some sort of view that they have, a view about themselves, a view about the world. Usually it's a negative view, and that's what's causing them to feel a bit stuck and to be caught in a pattern. So helping them shift that is really valuable, and it makes it a lot easier to do that when you've done the opening the door first. Because again, if we just jump straight in, so if a student, for example, is perfectionistic and they say, I really need to get perfect on this exam, and we say, no, that's silly. You don't have to get perfect. It's totally fine if you don't. If we go straight there, they're just gonna be caught in their perspective. It's not gonna land for them. They're just gonna probably ignore us. But if we've taken the time to examine with them, what's happening? Why is it that you feel that way? What's underneath that for you? And then we drop in a little paradigm shift. They're open to receive it. So that's an important piece of that. But we do need to drop that in, help them see things a different way. And sometimes that's just being curious. We don't have to tell them something. We can ask a question. I wonder what would happen if you did fail. Do you think that would be the worst thing in the world? Like those kinds of questions. The second thing we can do in taking action is to remind students of their power. So this is about remembering and pointing out things that they've already done to help themselves. This is really important because, again, when we're caught in any kind of pattern, we forget how to help ourselves. We forget that we've ever helped ourselves. So before we actually do something positive, we have to remember that we can do something positive. And then finally is skills. Skills, and this is reminding students of a task or a thing or an activity or something they can do to help themselves. Now, again, this is the one we usually want to jump to, because as soon as we see a challenge happening, it's really tempting to go, let's just make that better. I know if they just took some deep breaths, or I know if they just did this activity, they'd feel better. But if we take the time to open the door and help with the paradigm shift and remind them of their power, then when we remind them of a skill, it's going to be so much more meaningful. And they're going to do that skill, and they're going to understand why they're doing that skill. And they're going to understand that they did that themselves. And it's going to contribute to their more of that sense of power and a more of a paradigm shift of, I'm actually okay and I actually can help myself. So these are the 6 points that you want to always focus on covering in any conversation with a student that's struggling in any way. So let's dive into what this looks like when it comes to perfectionism. So the first step here is part of opening the door, and we're validating. So what does that mean? What validation means is we're helping students understand that their feelings are normal. So this is really important, because when we're in a perfectionistic pattern, we are trying to control our feelings. So usually our feelings are of unworthiness, or, a low self-esteem type of a feeling, or an out of control feeling. And so that's why we're trying to clamp it down so much. So what we want to do is help them understand that it's okay to feel that way. It's normal to feel that way. And that's a really good entryway into this conversation. Perfectionism is very, very common in big or small ways. And I always laugh because I'm a terrible perfectionist in a way. There are perfectionists that are perfectionist and then they do everything they possibly can to make everything perfect. I'm a perfectionist, but I don't do that. I just feel really bad that I haven't done it correctly. So again, there's lots of different versions of it. And again, sometimes the perfectionist is the person that stays and does everything to the last minute. And then sometimes it's even the student that doesn't do their work or doesn't hand it in because they're so concerned about failing that they won't even put in any effort. So it is a very common pattern. So that's the first thing. We want to help them understand that it's normal to feel that way. And off the back of that, and this is really important, no matter what a student is struggling with, there's always this underlying suspicion that there's something wrong with me. Because especially if they don't have peer role models that they're hearing from talking about similar challenges, there's this assumption, this is only me, I'm the problem. And especially if you're perfectionistic, again, as soon as we start addressing this conversation, a perfectionistic student will immediately go, oh my goodness, I've messed up. I should have got this right. I shouldn't be struggling with this, so it's going to come up throughout the whole conversation. So you'll try to talk about perfectionism and then they'll become perfectionistic about that. That's normal. So we want to be making sure we're reinforcing there's nothing wrong with them. And we understand why they feel that way. So that's basic validation. You're normal, there's nothing wrong with you, and I understand. I understand you, I understand why you're feeling that way. This is a really, really helpful place to start with a perfectionistic student. So what does that look like? Here's some examples of some of the words that you can use, the conversations that you can have that really help open the door. Really simple. It's normal to feel like you want to get everything right. That's because you care. So just a normalizing statement like that, that's a really normal thing to feel. And again, you can give more context if you know more context. This is a really challenging test, or I know there's a lot weighing on this, or I know your parents really care about you getting a good mark. It's really normal to feel like you want to succeed. So just that normalizing. Using yourself is super, super powerful in any of these conversation pieces and any of these elements of the conversation. And you don't have to divulge any secrets. You don't have to be vulnerable in a way that leaves you exposed, but it's so helpful. And I definitely use this a lot when I'm talking to students. Just saying a little bit of what's true for you, that is very normalizing. So, for example, when I mess up, I feel really bad about it too. Failure is a really hard thing to feel. So, just giving that context, it's not just you. And that is so, so powerful, especially you as the educator, as their teacher, they look up to you. And there's this natural assumption in kids that adults, are perfect in a certain way because they don't see, it's hard for them to perspective take. So if they hear that a teacher that they admire, that is, amazing in their eyes, also feels that way, that's very, very normalizing. And then finally, I really get that feeling of wanting everything to be perfect. So just stating that, again, even if that's not something that's necessarily true for you, you can just say, I get that. I get that, that feeling of wanting everything to be perfect. I get that. I understand that. So just saying one of these types of statements is a really good opener for the conversation. So I want you to just take a minute and think about a student that that has perfectionistic tendencies. And I want you to write down in your own words. So again, you don't have to use these exact words. These are just examples, but knowing what validation is, knowing what the goals are, see if you can write down a sentence or a couple of sentences that you would use to try to validate this student as you start the conversation with them. So I'll just give you a minute for that. Great, love this. I've been there and it wasn't easy. That's a great way to validate. Love it. Right? So, whoops, sorry. Just anything that really helps them understand, I get you. I get what you're going through. Beautiful. Okay, awesome. So let's move on to the next step. So the next step in opening the door is patterns. So we're trying to help this student understand that they are in a perfectionistic pattern. So what does that mean? So we want to help them notice that they're trying to control the situation. They're trying to control either the way other people see them, or the way they see themselves, or the way that this makes them feel. And that's usually what's underneath it all. So we might be trying to control other people, the way other people see us, or the way we see ourselves. But ultimately, deep down, it's because we don't want to feel like a failure. And that's what's really important. It always comes down to our feelings. Even if we think it's about other people, it's really about how we feel when we think other people are disappointed in us. So that's really important. So what does that look like? Do you think you're worried about what it feels like to get it wrong? So just a simple question like that. Do you think that's what you're worried about? And so again, it's very subtle and very simple, and it might feel very obvious to them, but you're helping them name it. And this is really, really important. They might go, yeah, of course I'm worried about getting it wrong. But even the fact that you ask the question puts this question in their mind of, oh, is that not what everybody feels? Maybe I don't have to feel like that. That's what we're trying to open the door to. So we're just naming it. Okay, even if a lot of us have that, that's still something we can notice. That's an interesting worry to have. I wonder why we have that worry. Or sometimes I'm so worried about what other people are thinking that I make decisions that aren't actually the best for my well-being. So again, using your own experience and pointing out that what might be true for them. And I do this a lot too. And I always make sure that I'm honest when I make a statement like that. So you don't want to, be saying something that isn't true for you. But I like to, when I notice something in a student, I like to say my pattern that relates to that. So I will say something like this to help them notice that, oh, that's a pattern that you have. It's a less confronting way than saying, hey, I notice you're really worried about what people think, and that causes you to make bad decisions. That is quite confronting. So if you talk about yourself, it's a really interesting way, and you can say, I wonder if you're doing something similar, or you can just leave it there. Just the whole point of this is that you're helping them start to notice that there's a pattern going on. That's the goal. So I want you to take another minute and think of that student or a different student, or whoever you want to think of. This might not even be a student you're thinking of. This could be someone in your personal life or a colleague. Perfectionism is everywhere. And just see what is the sentence you would say that would help them recognize, encourage them to recognize, open the door for them to start noticing that it's a pattern they're caught in. So I'll just give you a minute for that. Beautiful. Okay. So the last part of opening the door is about feelings. So when it comes to perfectionism, what we're trying to do is help them talk about and think about the feelings that are underneath perfectionism. Because remember, perfectionism is all about trying to get away from or control those uncomfortable feelings. So we want to help them start to recognize what is that feeling that's underneath this, and then helping them understand that those feelings are safe. Because remember, perfectionism is a form of anxiety. So it's all about kind of controlling it and feeling like those feelings are not okay to feel, that it would be so horrible to feel failure that I might be actually physically harmed by it, or it'll be so embarrassing that I would never recover. And so when they feel that those feelings are safe, we can then help them understand that they don't need to be controlled or avoided. That's the goal. And that's why it's so important to openly address the feelings, because it helps them. Even just talking about the feelings will help them start to relate to those feelings a little bit more. And the more we've related to something, the less our brain can tell us, you have to stay away from that. And we'll get into this at the end. This is why one of the most important things with perfectionism is that they actually feel the feeling of failure. Because if they feel that feeling and then they realize the world doesn't end, all of a sudden they start to see that those feelings are a little bit more safe. But when we're in this opening the door, we're just starting to talk about these feelings. So what do we say? Something that you all know that I love, if you've been to any of my sessions before, is noticing our feelings in our body. And perfectionism being a form of anxiety, is there definitely are going to be tension or some sort of body signals that are related to it. So simply just asking the question, if you notice a student is pretty amped up about getting something perfect, or they're not taking a break, or they're really, full on in their perfectionistic pattern, just helping them draw attention to what's happening in your body right now is a really great way for them to start recognizing, oh, I'm feeling pretty anxious right now, actually. And then asking the question, what do you feel when you make a mistake? Really simple, open question that can help them start to explore. They might have never thought of it before, and then it's a great way to just plant the seed. It might be, they might go, oh, it's the worst feeling in the world. Okay, tell me about it. So it's a way to just start exploring what that feeling is. And then, some students won't want to talk about their feelings. That's fine. So we can also just make statements. I know it's really hard to feel like you messed up, but it's okay to feel that way. It's a really normal part of learning. So just identifying the feeling, this is really important. So we're not going straight to saying, it's okay, don't worry about it. What we're saying is, I get that that's a hard thing to feel, and that's a normal part of learning, but I understand that there's a feeling going on there. Just identifying that will help them to start understanding and connecting to that feeling a little bit more. Okay, so I want to think of your perfectionistic student and write down, what language would you use knowing them? Would you ask a question? Would you make a statement? Would you say something about yourself to really start to help them explore the feelings that are underneath their perfectionism, the thing they're trying to avoid or trying to control. Beautiful. Okay. Now, once we've opened the door, once we've used some of these tools to normalize and help, open that space to that self-reflection, now we move into taking action. So this first piece is shifting the paradigm. So what we're trying to do is helping students change their views about their own self-worth. So a perfectionistic student will always think that their self-worth is dependent on the outcome, their output. And this can run so deep. I definitely feel this absolutely in my life still. When I have to cut back and do less, it's grates on me. Or if I have to say that I can't do something, it's really challenging, because for sure, a lot of my self-worth remains on that, what I'm doing in the world. And so in order to change that, we have to shift and we have to introduce this concept. Maybe you're worthy not because of what you do, but just because of who you are. Maybe that's enough. So this is a really important thing that we have to drop in. And also change their views about their need to please others. So underneath perfectionism is always that belief of, if I please them, then everything will be okay, then I'll be safe. But of course, that doesn't actually work, because nobody else can actually make us safe. And we can't please people all the time. So that search for always pleasing other people will always end in disappointment. So we want to help them shift that thinking. It's not about pleasing other people. And then also change their perspective about their need to control their feelings. So their need to never feel failure, their need to never disappoint someone. This is a really big thing to shift. So paradigm shifting is huge. It's something that is a lifelong challenge. And as I mentioned, even when you can see it, it doesn't mean it's that easy to change. So again, your goal isn't to change the paradigm of your students, because you can't. The goal is to drop a pearl of wisdom in and just let it simmer, let them contemplate it. And that is so important and so vital. And it's important to remember that as an educator. Even if you don't see a significant change happening, just dropping in that perspective shifting is so powerful, and it will help them so much in their lives. So examples. The effort you put in is really what helps you grow, not the outcome. So simply statements like that, where you're helping them reorient. So they're doing an assignment, pointing out the effort rather than what the grade is. That's a really important shift. If you really care about it and you're really into it, that's what matters. It's not about answering all of my questions that I've asked perfectly. Now, that's hard as a teacher, because you want them to answer all of your questions perfectly. So just making sure for those perfectionistic students that you are counterbalancing your suggestions to them. You know what? Why don't you try to really enjoy this process? Or why don't you really get into this topic? And don't worry so much about the marking rubric that I've given you, because it's not so much about the outcome. So helping them shift that way. When we work really hard to make other people happy, we can forget what makes us happy. So using this we language is helpful, again, to normalize. This is something that happens for us. And you're just dropping in that little pearl of wisdom. You're not saying, hey, I think you need to stop trying to make people happy, because that's really hard. You're just helping them notice, hey, maybe that's something that we don't have to do. And pointing out things that have nothing to do with them being perfectionistic. So things that you see when they're letting go. So for example, I have an example here. I think you're really funny when you're goofing around. So maybe when they're goofing around is when they're not being perfectionistic, and you can see that. You can see they're just letting loose. pointing that out and saying, hey, I really like that element of your personality, showing them that they're worthy for things beyond their output and the things that they produce. So I'll just give you a quick minute to jot down some language that you could use that and again, we don't have to know what their perspective is necessarily, or the paradigm that they have to shift, or that we want to help them shift. We can guess. So it's okay to guess, and usually using your own experience is really valuable. If you can relate to what they're feeling and you know what thoughts you get caught in, that's a good place to start. So it's okay if we get it a little bit off, because we're not saying you are like this. We're just offering them these little tidbits of information. So see if you can think of a tidbit of information, a shift, a perspective, a paradigm shift that you can drop in that you think might help this student. Okay, so the next step is helping students remember their power. So this is all about remembering what they've done in the past, remembering their agency. So help them understand their ability to make choices that support their long-term well-being. So basically, supporting your long-term well-being is the exact opposite of perfectionistic behavior, because perfectionist behavior is about pleasing other people, and it's about being perfect, and it's not about our well-being at all. So when we're making choices that are good for our long-term well-being, that means we're breaking through that perfectionistic pattern. So helping them understand that they can do that. Helping them see that they've already shown an ability to let go and be spontaneous. So we're helping to remind them, again, before we encourage them to do a skill, we're breaking the ice a little bit to say, hey, you're doing this already. So examples. Asking about failure is really helpful for students. Have you ever failed before? What happened? That might uncover a really big, awful story of failure, which is why they're so perfectionistic. Or it might help them uncover, you know what, I did fail at something and it wasn't that big of a deal. Either way, that's a really helpful exploration for them. When you're with your best friends, I think you don't worry about this stuff so much, do you? So this is another way, if you see that, again, it doesn't have to be with their best friends, but if you see that there's certain situations, maybe it's when they're playing a sport that they love or they're doing art, when you see them just get lost in something and have fun with something, you want to remind them that they do that, because kids live so moment to moment that they won't realize that that's a skill. And what you're trying to help them tap into is that, you know, even if they're super rigid and they're super hard on themselves, they're not always like that. And when they can remember that, they can then apply that skill to those situations where they're quite intense and hard on themselves. If you're really, okay, so this is trying to help them notice when they've done something to help themselves. So an example of this is, if you're really tired and you're trying to study, do you ever go to bed so that you get the rest you need? So you're just trying to, that's just one example of trying to help them recognize that even though they push themselves a lot, they still will do things in their own best interest. You're trying to remind them of that, because we're trying to, and this is a really powerful technique for any student, is that we're showing them the flip side. So if we see this intense pattern that they're in, we want to find what's the opposite of that, and how can I find an example where the student does that? So where do you actually stop and don't study anymore and actually take care of your health and go to sleep? I want to remind you of that so that you can make more of those decisions, because the more we point out things to students and validate them for something, the more they'll clue into, oh yeah, I do that. And then they're more likely to do that in the future. Okay, so I'll just give you a minute to think of how you would say this. What would you remind the student of? Do you have an example you can think of where they have helped themselves? Do you have an example where they failed and it wasn't that big of a deal? So just think of something that you could use to remind them of their power. Beautiful. Okay, so last piece, skills. So we're trying to help students do anything that helps them become more spontaneous and less focused on being perfect. So that could be finding fun in the learning, failing intentionally. This is a really important skill that you can encourage in your students. And I know that's not that easy in a school context, but setting up situations where they do have a sense of failure and it's okay. Taking breaks, noticing when they're too tense, self-soothing. So these are all examples. And the thing with skills is that it really doesn't matter what they're doing, as long as they're doing something that brings them out of that intense hyper focus on perfection. So anything, doesn't have to be a therapeutic skill necessarily. It could be literally playing a game. It could be taking a break. It could be anything. But that's the goal. We're trying to remember, as we've sort of helped them, lead them there, now they're ready to do something to help themselves and it'll be meaningful. So simply a very simple question, like what might help you feel less pressure right now? Just what would be something that would take the intensity away? Something that comes from them is great. It's really helpful when it comes from them. They might not be able to think of something, but you can always ask. What do you love about what you're learning and why? So really helping them get back to the joy of what they're doing instead of the pressure of the outcome. So what do you love about that sport? What is exciting about it if they're really focused on winning? Or what do you love about writing if they're doing a writing assignment and they're perfectionistic about it? So just helping them reorient to that. Now, this is something that I really encourage you to do with perfectionistic students, but of course you have to do it within the bounds of what works in your school setting. But encouraging them to hand in an assignment without checking it over, or intentionally leaving a piece out, or not doing their best work, or doing a topic area that they're not that comfortable in, so they're not going to be as good at, a topic area that they would know that well. Do you think you can do that? So if you can encourage them to do that and encourage them to make that mistake, and then to see that there was a mistake, so that doesn't mean that they hand it in and you go, perfect, you get an A+ anyway. That means they hand it in, you go, okay, here were all the errors, here were the things that you could improve on, and then have that conversation with them to say, hey, how does that feel to have this feedback, to know that it wasn't perfect? Because what you want for them to do is to recognize it's okay to feel that way. Because if they don't have any experience, if they're doing everything in their power to avoid that experience of failure, they're never going to feel okay when it happens, which it will randomly. We can't always be perfect. So if you can give them situations where they do fail a little bit, and you can help them, guide them through that feeling, that is such a powerful gift that you can give them. So I want to take just a minute and just think of what's a skill you could suggest to this student. So it could be a little failure task. It could just be that you're asking them a question of what helps them. Just see if there's something that you could use, some language you could use to point that out. Okay, beautiful. So what you have in front of you are 6 different sentence stems, questions, conversation ideas. And the most important thing to remember is that any interaction helps. So you don't have to use all of those conversations in the same conversation. A student might, something might come up randomly and a student is saying something perfectionistic and you can just make a response. You might just get the chance to ask one question. Maybe you only validate them. That's fine. And then the next time you might remind them of their power. So there's no script in terms of how you have to do it. But if you have this awareness of these are the 6 things that I'm trying to help in terms of creating this space for my student to be able to figure out their own perfectionism and get to the bottom of why they feel that way, and maybe start making some choices that are really conducive to their long-term well-being, instead of stuck in that attitude that they have to get it all right. If you have that as your framework, then every single conversation you have that embeds any element of that will be so, so helpful for your students. And the most important thing is to remember to just have the conversation. Don't be worried about bringing that up, because the more you bring it up and the more you help them recognize it, the more power they have to be able to recognize it themselves and to do something to help themselves. So I will just finish with, this is the book that will be coming out in March. If you are interested, you can, I have a website that'll link you to, the QR code will link you to the website so you can find out a little bit more about it. You can pre-order it if you are interested in that. But the idea with it is really, it's guided conversation. So you get to see actually the breakdown of conversations that I've had with students in the filming of open parachute videos, if you're using open parachute. So the whole idea is to give that structure and that confidence. But thank you so much for listening. I'm so excited that so many people joined for this perfectionistic topic, because it is something that so many students struggle with. If anyone has any questions or comments, I know we're right at the end, but happy to answer them. And otherwise, I will see you next time.